you can get cans or you can get something else. But most people drink Cokes in glass bottles at convenience stores, and those glass bottles then are put back into a case, and those cases are brought back to the bottling plant, and then they're washed. So they wash with detergent, you know, several times to make sure that they're clean, and then they refill that bottle. And that same glass bottle will go on 40 or 50 or 60 rounds of use before it's taken out of commission, gets too stuffed up and you take it out.
Yeah, most people use straws.
Yeah,
They're afraid
exactly.
of
Exactly, because of the contamination of the bottle. But those bottles are used a lot, so it's a classic kind of dilemma. You're using a lot less materials because you're reusing the material over and over and over again, but you use a lot more water to keep those bottles clean. So it has a negative impact on the water use. So if you look at this map, what do you see in terms of, would you be worried if you ran Africa for Coca-Cola? See where the bottling plants are? What do you notice?
There's far fewer appearances.
Yeah, so big plants, not very efficient. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, you know, historically Coca-Cola plants are built where the population centers are. And that's actually changing in some places, like Mexico, for example. They always built plants where people were, but those areas have become so developed and so water scarce that they can't operate those anymore, so they need to move bottling plants to where the water is instead of where the people are. And that also is a trade-off, because then you're actually further away from your customers. You probably have longer supply chains to get them the product. So again, water driving a whole set of decisions around this. So that was the mapping. The survey I talked about assessed a whole set of issues around what was happening in water in the plants. And then we said, okay, what are the risks related to the company? How do you actually translate this as being meaningful to the company? So we identified 6 categories of risk related to water. If a watershed is degrading where a bottling plant is running, that's a problem, right? It means the quality is going down or the quantity is going down of water, and or that there's competition with other users of that water. So there's watershed risk, supply reliability, efficiency, cost, so supply economics, compliance both with company and with external policy, and then social competitiveness is their conflict with other users. So these are the 6 categories of risk. And then we put it through kind of a Monte Carlo simulation of saying, okay, for watershed risk, you know, the survey told us, is there high water abstraction? Are they using a lot of water? Is there climate change happening? Demographic change? Is the kind of, you know, population growing fast? Development change? Are people getting more wealthy? Is the soil or groundwater getting contaminated? That suggests that the resource is under stress. And then that's a risk only if people can connect it to Coca-Cola. And if they connect it to Coca-Cola, it could result in the government withdrawing the license of the company, the community responding by increasing the cost of water, or the international NGOs getting on them, causing reputational damage. And for each of these, we then work with the CFO's office to say, okay, what's the likelihood of those things happening? And if they happen, how costly would they be? So through that process, we were able to kind of take this whole set of data coming from the surveys, and we're able to document that we think this is like a $5 billion problem over the next 5 years. So that was quite helpful to the company to say, look, you have a $5 billion problem. Some of that risk you can't get rid of. You know, climate change, the company's not on its own going to change that in the next 5 or 10 years. But some of it could be mitigated. How much would it be worth to you if you could mitigate 50% of the risk? Would you spend $5 billion on a $5 billion problem? Probably not. Would you spend $1 billion? That's still pretty expensive, right, as an insurance premium. Would you spend $500 million to mitigate $2.5 billion in risk? So anyway, it was a different conversation to say, look, the company doesn't have to invest to mitigate risk. It can decide to do it if they can do it in an efficient way, if they can invest in ways that would reduce that risk. And they're going to have to do it outside the walls of the plant. So what was interesting is this is a map of the risk profile for a division. So let's say this is Southeast Asia, and these are plants. Each of these bars is a plant Southeast Asia. So this bar here is, these two plants have a lot of risk. It's mostly made up of the dark blue, which is compliance, and the light blue, which is social competitive. So the way you would read this map is to say, these two plants are out of compliance, meaning they're probably not treating their wastewater. I mentioned before the company has standards and it required all of their plants to treat their wastewater, but there were a few places where that didn't happen. So they're not treating their wastewater, and lo and behold, people are pissed. You know, there's conflict with other users because they're not treating their wastewater. It's actually not surprising that you have those coming together. So this was pretty interesting because you had a map now for how you could mitigate risk in the division. You say, look, best way to treat risk is build 5 wastewater treatment plants in these 5 locations. That'd take a huge chunk of this risk out right away. And they're about $1 million a pop, so they're not cheap, but you could get rid of a bunch of the risk if you did this. And then all of the plants have this conflict with other users, or there's tensions with other users. So maybe you need a division-wide strategy that says, let's engage with NGOs and local governments in the places where we operate so we can see what we can do to reduce that risk. So this was a pretty good template for developing a strategy for the company. And then this is just showing in the different parts of the world that the risks look really different. So in this division, there are a lot of red and a lot of yellow, a lot of watershed risk, a lot of supply reliability. So this is in Latin America, in Mexico, where there's a lot of droughts and a lot of water scarcity, where plants don't have access to water because the watershed is degrading. So that's the character here. This division totally different. So the shape of what risk profile looked like in different parts of the world was pretty different.
And where is the third division?
That is, I think, in the Pacific region. Yeah. So these are just some examples of the kind of risk profiles that we came up with. So the company set a 10-year strategy. You know, this is all about developing a strategy to address this. It had to start with making sure that the plants treated water well, but that actually wasn't where most of the risk was. The biggest risks were in watershed degradation and in conflict with other users. What was interesting about that is I'm sure Dirk talks a lot about metrics. In the company, the one metric that the company was tracking in water was water efficiency. But that was actually the least important contributor to risk. Of those 6 categories I showed you, efficiency was on that list. It was the least important contributor to the risk of the company. So the one metric that the company was tracking was actually the one that was least important for contributing to risk. And the most important ones, watershed issues and conflict with other users, there was no program, there was no metric, there was no nothing. So I think that question of what are your metrics actually shining a light on and what are you missing because of what metrics you have is a pretty important question.
Can you give an example of conflict with other users?
Yeah, so in places that they weren't treating their wastewater, it was likely that the company may have negative articles in the newspaper. It could be lawsuits, it could be fines. So those are all signs that something's not right with other users. Also, in some places, it wasn't just other users, it's that the competition sometimes will put out negative, sometimes false, information about the company. So sometimes competitors were actually the ones that were, doing the most damage to the company by spreading rumors. So those are the kind of examples of the social contact. So, but beyond the plant, how do we get the company involved in doing community partnerships? How do we protect the watersheds? And then coax some big global brands. So how do you use the power of the brand to address water issues? So I'm just going to quickly go through this. The goals that the company set were in those areas. So reducing water use by 2020, improving water efficiency, 25%, treating 100% wastewater. The replenish goal was, could the company essentially have like a carbon neutral goal related to water? Could it have as much water that it's putting back into environments and communities at the same amount as what they're using for their products? So that was what their replenishment goal, essentially water neutrality goal. And then managing risk, which is the process I just showed you. led to, and I don't have to go through all the slides, but one of the great things that kind of got created through this was, instead of the focus inside the plant, we now had a reason to be involved in getting engaged with governments and NGOs and other local partners around addressing water issues. And all of the plants had gone through the process to say, yeah, we actually know that those are big issues. So they had a motivation to take on issues, to engage with the local governments and the NGOs and say, okay, what should we do here? So I transitioned from the risk assessment to leading the Community Water Partnerships program. And what that did is essentially we're like internal consultants where we go work with the bottlers and the local divisions, say, okay, you saw that you had a lot of risk around watershed issues. What might you do? What would a good project be? Who could you do it with? So what kind of NGO is active in the region that you could partner with? What are the governments investing on this issue? How can you form a partnership? And then we had a matching grant. So I administered about a $4 million grant that could, if the bottler was willing to put $50,000 in, then I could put $50,000 in from our fund. And then we worked with USAID and Gates Foundation, UNEP, UNDP, a whole set of other organizations that if they also thought that was an important project, they would match it again. So if it was $25,000 from the bottler, $25,000 from my matching grant, and $50,000 from an external partner, we could get that kind of 2-to-1 leverage of investment to grow these projects into being much more substantial than they were. So over a period of about 3 years, we launched 150 of these projects around the world. So during that phase, that's when I did a lot of travel. I was mostly on the plane during that phase, going to different places, launching these projects. So we did like a Mekong river restoration project with WWF. So went to Cambodia and helped to get that project set up. We did a project on water and sanitation in primary schools in Africa, in Kenya. So I went there to launch that project. So it was really cool because we were going out and finding partnerships with all of these organizations to do things that the company had a stake in, but hadn't really seen that opportunity before. So we launched about 150 of those over 3 years, and that continues. So now there's 600 or 700 of those kind of projects globally. Some of those were big partnerships. So Coke also partnered with WWF and did projects in 7 river basins around the world. That set of partnerships, I think, really positioned the company differently around water issues. The last phase of the project, we said, look, 70% of water is used in agriculture. So Coke is actually a huge agricultural buyer. So it buys, it's the global biggest buyer of sugar, but it also buys coffee, tea, juice. So it's in the top 3 global buyers of all of those commodities. So Coke actually is in the food and ag business in a way that you don't often think about. So the last phase was to launch a sustainable agriculture program where we went out and tried to work with our suppliers to improve their water use. If you think about it, sugarcane is very water intensive. So it takes about 200 liters of water to produce that 1 liter of sugar that goes into a liter of product. So all of this sort of improvement of the bottling plant water efficiency is pretty meaningless if you could have any impact on sugarcane production and manage water better, or coffee production, or tea production, or juice production. So the last phase was launching a sustainable agriculture program to try to see how a big brand like Coke could impact its supply chain in ways that could achieve better outcomes on this. So the last phase of the project was really about trying to find where the levers were to move the company beyond what we could do just within the company itself. So I will wrap there. Questions?
What'd you say was the name of your class?
Business strategies for sustainability. Yeah.
So you were saying like in the class that you teach,
Mhm. Yeah.
it's kind of like well, everybody is maybe a little bit of a different mindset, but do you feel like you've seen a change in people who are business
Yeah, I think, I see two forms. One is that some people who come to business school think that there is ways of using private sector strategies to drive positive change in the world. So they're interested in things like B Corps or in working in corporate sustainability or, a whole range of kind of strategies of using business strategies to impact these kinds of issues. The other is, I think you have, and that's maybe 50% of the students. The other 50, I think, it's not that they don't care about these issues, but they tend to compartmentalize. They care about these issues as citizens, as parents, as people, but they think about their business life being different. And this is all about maximizing competitive advantage and being as profitable as possible. And you actually, try to keep those apart. So I have seen the shift more of the former and less of the latter. But I see still those are two very dominant kind of modes of how people deal with these things. At Fuqua in particular, there's a lot of interest in social entrepreneurship, which is, starting businesses to do, social ventures, but doing it with a business model so that you have revenues and you manage your costs and you try to find a way to make it economically sustainable. So social entrepreneurship is big, impact investing is big, which is to say, can we use our investments to drive positive outcomes? And then the stuff that I teach is mostly how do you inflect the strategies of big companies to do things that have positive impacts. So, and that's typically not companies that are, it's not part of their mandate to be environmentally or socially responsible. Some are, like Patagonia, it's part of their mission to be environmentally sustainable. Red Hat in the triangle here is going through the process to define themselves